This B Podcast Network show is presented by IXL. IXL's all-inclusive online teaching and learning platform simplifies edtech needs and accelerates achievement in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts. IXL delivers personalized learning across a comprehensive pre-K-12 curriculum, including math, language arts, science, and social studies, and it helps you assess student performance through actionable real-time insights at every level of your school or district. This one solution performs work that typically requires dozens of different tools. Want to find out why so many leading districts trust IXL? Visit ixl.com/BE. That's ixl.com/BE. Welcome in, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. It is always my pleasure to have you with us, and I think this is going to be your pleasure as well. We're joined by two great guests who have been on the show before, but today we're going to have a really collaborative discussion here and talk about a lot of things I think you'll find quite interesting. So if you're listening, my guests, Caroline Tomlinson and Katie Novak, you probably have one or more of their books. If not, you can go get them after you listen to the rest of the episode. Just in case you are forgetting, Caroline Tomlinson is the William Clay Parrish Jr. Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development, where she served as Chair of Educational Leadership, Foundations, and Policy and Co-Director of the university's Institutes on Academic Diversity. She has authored or co-authored over 300 books, book chapters, articles, and other educational materials. Katie Novak is an internationally renowned education consultant, a graduate instructor at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, and the best-selling author of 14 books on inclusive practices. Previously, they were on to discuss, respectively, Katie's book, UDL Now, the third edition, and Carol's book, So Each May Soar. But today, we're having a conversation about differentiated instruction, universal design for learning, what they have in common, what makes them unique, how we can clarify misunderstandings so these practices can be used to maximum benefit of learners, and a lot more that I don't know about yet because we haven't had the conversation yet, but I'm willing to promise it'll be good. So Katie and Carol, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Katie, I promised before we started that I was going to put you on the spot to begin, and that is because it was really your idea to have this conversation. Last time you were on the show, we talked a little bit about how, a lot of people ask you some version of the question, UDL and DI, aren't they pretty much the same thing? What's the difference? And that's something that comes up frequently. So kind of wanted to have you start us off there a little bit with, what are some of the questions you get around that? What sort of sparked the idea to have this conversation so we can hopefully clarify and dive in?
Yes, I am so excited for the conversation. So I do a lot of work focused on building multi-tiered systems and implementing universal design for learning. And if I had $1 for every time someone says, didn't we used to call that differentiated instruction, I would be a billionaire. And so I have tried throughout my practice to research and clarify what is the difference, recognizing from what I perceive to be the differences, both of them are absolutely necessary and they complement each other. And so I'm going to share with you generally what my answer is. And then I welcome, Dr. Tomlinson, you to point out and identify any misconceptions that I have, because I'm always learning and growing, and both of these frameworks evolve. But the way that I explain universal design for learning is it's very focused on the proactive design of a lesson that best meets the needs of a really inclusive classroom. And so it generally starts off with this concept of firm goals and flexible means. And so a UDL practitioner asks themselves, what really is it that all learners have to know and do? And then based on the variability and the beautiful differences in a classroom, what would be the barriers of one size fits all design. So if I were to ask all students to read the same text in hard copy and then share what they're learning in a 5-paragraph essay written in blue or black ink in an exam book, who would be excluded and why? And a UDL practitioner starts to recognize barriers. And we don't say a student is a barrier, but we say if learning, for example, about the 3 branches of government is the goal, you don't only have to read a hard copy of a printed text. There's lots of ways that you could learn that. And there's lots of ways you could share what you're learning, because a lot of the social studies standards start with explain. They don't say explain in writing or explain on a multiple choice test. So UDL is very much the design of that lesson, the blueprint, the architecture of the lesson. But the only way to measure if something is in fact universally designed is if all learners learn. We cannot measure universal design in the intention of the designer. Was every learner able to learn? And what I've realized is, despite a designer's best efforts, you get into a classroom, you say to students, all right, everyone, choose what you need, start working. And then we start saying, we have to be a little bit more responsive to what's happening. Those 3 students are still struggling, so we have to pull them for a small group. And those students are done early. I'm going to have to provide something additional. And from my perception, the lesson is the construct that is universally designed. And then when we are in the space, we have to get to know our learners and be responsive and use data to differentiate instruction. And so I talk about it as being kind of pre-planning and proactive, and then being really responsive to the needs of the class in the moment. But we had an opportunity, Dr. Tomlinson and I, to have a chat, and differentiated instruction is much bigger than just being responsive in a classroom. So I'm so happy to have this conversation and to kind of have a definitive answer of what these 2 frameworks are and how they work together.
In my work, I've collaborated directly with hundreds of educators to support their success. Do you know which of their EdTech frustrations comes up time and again? The sheer number of tools out there and the difficulty of knowing which ones schools like theirs are using to get results. IXL is different. Not only does it perform the functions of dozens of tools, it's currently delivering results for 1 in 4 U.S. students, including those in 95 of the top 100 districts. Another major pain point that comes up: when a school is excited to implement a new tool only to find out the teachers hate it. Yikes. It helps to know that IXL is loved and trusted by more than 1 million teachers, saving them time on prep work while enabling them to better support student learning. IXL is research proven to accelerate achievement. Studies across 45 states show that IXL schools outperform non-IXL schools on state assessments. And independent research from Johns Hopkins University verifies that IXL meets ESSA Tier 1 standards. With those results combined with IXL's teacher-friendly reputation, what more could you ask for? If you have a goal to increase achievement for all students, make sure to find out what IXL can do for you. Visit IXL.com/BE for a demo. That's IXL.com/BE. Yeah, I think that, I'm learning as we go, but that's a great answer to me. But I think, the opportunity that provides is within that universal design, right? We have to fill the instruction piece, right? And as you said, make sure that students actually learn what we're meant to learn. So sort of, if you're asked the question from the other direction, are there other things that are worth highlighting, Carol, that I know that Katie touched on a lot of things, but there might be a couple of pieces to say, well, make sure we clarify this about DI, or we're not missing this, and not for the teacher who's trying to do this in practice, right? To say there's some other components here to learn about.
So yeah, both what you said and what she said. Yeah. The differentiation, I get the same question Katie does, so we'd have 2 wealthy individuals if that came with me every time that was asked. And I think about that a lot. And one thing that comes to me is, who knows what differentiation is? Who knows what understanding by design is? And by that, I don't mean I don't know anything and Katie doesn't know anything. But there are so many people that practice differentiation, and I assume the same thing would be said with UDL. And I look and I think, that's an interesting interpretation you've got there. That, where did that come from? Or I can see kind of where you're going, but oh my goodness, there's a knot in the fabric over here. And so I've worked with this for such a long time that I know what I mean by it most of the time, although I'm continually learning. I don't think I ever get any closer to the finish line. But if we're really gonna talk about what are the differences, then I guess what I would say is, where is the stuff that's written that is so clear that says this is exactly what has to happen here to be one or the other. My general theory, actually, Ross, and I said this to Katie when we talked before, I don't think I'm not real sure it matters much what the differences are. I think both models are trying to accomplish really the same thing. Mm. And it is so very difficult for us to make any kind of change happen in a school that I'm not real sure how advantageous it is to argue over or debate over, small semantic differences or what comes first, second, or third in something. To me, what I say to people is there are some differences in the model, and I think they're kind of interesting. And I would add here, not necessarily to them. Maybe they matter in some places and don't in others, or to some people and not in others. But to me, they're two models with exactly the same goal, heading in the same direction. And one of the issues that I have when that question comes up is that it often seems that people are posing it as a competition. This is what I've chosen and it's the best, and this other thing over here needs to get out of the way. And I really, really become testy when I see a magazine published, UDL does this, differentiation does this. And my instinct almost always is, I'll let somebody else speak to the accuracy of the UDL thing, but the differentiation piece is a hot mess right here, right now. And so I keep coming back to that. What is the standard? Where does it come from? And what's the benefit of the debate? But having said that, one of the things that keeps being interesting to me, again, is similarities as well as differences. So when Katie's talking about the importance of the lesson design, and that really is sort of the first step, where do we have to go? What barriers might be there? What can we do to get there? And then let's go in the classroom and see what happens and maybe differentiate instruction. That doesn't bother me in any way. But what we have said with differentiation is that differentiation is a teacher's proactive response. So exactly the same words to students' diversity. Mm-hmm. And this diagram changes all the time. I don't know if you've seen it, Katie. I'll be glad to send it to you. But what that means is that a teacher is going to try to get to really understand who these kids are. And proactively means going in every aspect of the work that we do by saying, so who are they and what can we do with this piece? So I'm fine with saying, start with the UDL framework for what a lesson is, and then differentiate when you get there. I'm also fine with saying, when you establish an environment, which is one of the most important and early things to do, the question ought to be, given the variety in front of me, what can I proactively do to make this environment work better? Mm-hmm. And what can I proactively do in tinkering with the curriculum to make that more responsive? And what can I do with my assessment practices to do some of the things that UDL talks about, as well as differentiation? How can I make sure the kids have clear learning targets that are very clear to them? How can I give them multiple ways to express what they've learned? But also, how can I be sure that the environment supports that? How can I be sure that the kids feel that they have the opportunity for varied time spans? How can I be sure that they understand the words that are written, that the assessment's written in, or that they can read any words off of a piece of paper? And what do I do for that kid who knows a whole heck of a lot and has now sat here for 3 or 4 weeks trying to learn this stuff and could do the assessment with his eyes closed and his hands tied? And yet I tell him he's wonderful. What's wrong with that scenario? Mm-hmm. And what do I do when I proactively plan lessons to plan in those differences that we know about the kids? What do I do before we get into the room to say, wait a minute, this initial plan I've got is sure better than it was 4 years ago, but I have these kids now that are a little different. So even before I go into the room, what do I do? We talk a lot about teacher-student partnerships in understanding why a classroom is developed the way a differentiated classroom is. And we talk about student-teacher partnerships in running that classroom and orchestrating it and making sure everything works for everybody. So I don't see any differences that would make us go, oh my goodness, how did they end up going in such different directions? I just don't think that's the case. Some of the differences that Katie and I discussed are sort of intellectually interesting to me, but I don't know that they're the end of the world in teacher practice in any way.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that came up in our previous discussion that is certainly highlighted here is just the continued revisiting and reflection and interrogation of how the practices are working over time, how students are changing, how learning environments are changing, what matters, what doesn't, right? And not, not needing to be precious about terminology when the goal is for students to learn. And to my view, there's likely a couple of reasons why some of the conflation or confusion happens. One is, as you both highlighted, similarity, if not, consistency in the why and the purpose of what the goals are of teaching and learning, why we're doing these things, right? And that the why doesn't define all of the how, and that whichever route you're going, right, you still have to understand the how to make sure that students receive the outcomes you want, but that it's not, some of it is semantics, some of it is just, okay, one or the other, like whichever approach you're taking, do you understand how to do it effectively? And that there also is probably confusion within the individual buckets, whether it's somebody who's not totally clear on exactly what is UDL or exactly what is differentiation, and then it's just all kind of mixing together. But I wanted to start with kind of that why piece and then defining like who students are, how we understand their goals, because I think that'll highlight a lot of the consistencies here. There was this line from, I think it came out of the book. It was certainly in some of the materials around the book, How to Differentiate Instruction in Academically Diverse Classrooms. But I thought this was a good illustration that you could replace differentiate instruction with UDL here, and you would have the same thing, which is we differentiate instruction to honor the reality of the students we teach as people, community members, friends, learners. I added that last part, but that, there's a whole paragraph around this, but it's about who they are as people, as learners, but also everything else about them. And this is why we're doing it, because it's teaching is not effective unless it's related to who's learning and how they're going to learn and how we can, ensure they learn. So I wanted to give each of you maybe an opportunity to talk about how to know who students are. What can an approach look like to determine, okay, if I know that my goal is I need to teach the students that I have, what are some of the practices or techniques, what are some of the ways maybe to utilize dialogue, student voice, choice, agency, all these things to really get an understanding of, okay, once I really know this, then I can worry about what strategies I'm using to teach them, right? But it all starts with knowing the learners. Katie, I'll let you start with this one as well.
So I think universal design for learning actually takes a step back, because it's not just about the learners you have. It's what are the barriers that you would need to eliminate to bring in learners who are currently excluded. So UDL is often a lens for trying to create a more inclusive classroom. And right now we have only 60% of students in this country are included in LRE1 when they have IEPs, which means 80% of the day or more. So it's more than here are the students in front of me in this class, but it's also why aren't all the students here with me in this class? And I think that that is a lens that may or may not be a little bit different, because we're starting to think about what would a classroom have to look like so that every single student could be included? And so it's starting to learn from what are now separate programs to think about what would the programming need to look like to be truly inclusive, because a classroom cannot be universally designed if students are not universally served. So I would say that a lot of the work that's done in the classroom to get to know students is very much through the lens of differentiated instruction, which is, this is who I'm serving right now, and what are you interested in, and what are your learning preferences and strengths, and really asking kids, whether you're doing a cogent dialogue or surveys or flexible learning profiles, which is, if this is the non-negotiable, if this is what we have to learn, or if this is what we have to be able to do, what are all the potential ways that we could do this? And to create this culture of error where kids are trying different things and self-reflecting and giving feedback to each other. And we're constantly using that data, really rich sources of data, street data, perception data, academic data, to say, is this leading us towards the goals? If so, let's keep moving in this direction. And if it's not, how do we, I guess, solve that problem through design? So I think there's going to be a lot of similarities, but one of the lenses of universal design is truly working towards, can we get to a place where all students really are included and have what they need? Because we're not there yet, but we're getting closer all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Carol, from your view, what's important for teachers to think about when they're getting to understand who their students are, right? How do I differentiate for them? Well, first I need to know who they are and what their strengths are and what they need and all of those things. What should teachers think about in that regard?
Okay, let me take a crack at Katie's ideas there, and then I'll take a crack at the, what do we do to make this thing happen? When I was talking with Katie before, I said that it seems to me that the genealogy of UDL and differentiation are slightly different. UDL was born from the notion of what Katie was talking about, inviting kids that have to be kept down the hall somewhere, sometimes even in the basement, into the classroom, and saying everybody belongs in here. There's room at the table for everybody in here. So because of that, UDL has had, and I think still continues to have, and I think it's a hugely important emphasis, the student who is not included in general ed classrooms, the kid who's walled off somewhere else. Differentiation in my iteration, remembering that people were talking about differentiation in China 5,000-10,000 years ago, and it's talked about really in Jewish scriptures and Muslim scriptures. You can find it everywhere. It was in the one-room schoolhouse here. So what I talk about is like a drop in the water compared to all that time. But my experience with it was in teaching, in the beginning, teaching seventh graders in a hugely diverse bimodal school population. About 45-50% of my kids in seventh grade were reading on a first or second grade level, and about 50% of them were reading on a near college level. And in the middle, we might have one or two students or even nobody. And so the question for us was, how do you have this group that is so clearly in your face diverse and create something that's wonderful that they can all participate in, and yet deal with the needs for each of them to be going in different directions, sometimes just for their own personal growth. The emphasis on special ed in the genealogy of UDL is still evident, and I think it should be evident. I think that's a massively important challenge that we have not made huge progress on. Made progress, but there's just such a really long way to go. So in a way, what barriers are there still has that emphasis of, if we can't remove the barriers that are keeping those kids out, how can we say we're really serving everybody well? Differentiation, my brand of it, keeps saying differentiation is not for a few kids, it's for everybody. And so if we have a student in here who has trauma history, we're going to have to do some things that are a little bit different than some of the things that we do for some other kids. But if we're doing those background things better, and if we understand how to have a flexible classroom, then when we invite other students in or they happen on us, we've got that flexibility in there, and you just say, okay, well, this is another change that's coming and this is not the end of the world. So I think that is one of the differences that I see. But again, I think those things are hand in glove. I wrote a book the last year of the pandemic, I think called Everybody's Classroom. And the idea of that one really is exactly what Katie was saying. What would it take to create a classroom that really was designed for everybody? So that if you had a student with learning issues, reading issues, writing issues, math issues, hard to sit still, can't pay attention, have a low socioeconomic background that is just oppressive, and racial disparities that are so huge for kids to carry around. What do you do with those kids? What would it take in the classroom that is a differentiated classroom for those kids to be able to come and join us, and for us not to freak out because they got there? And so in that, I address some of the kinds of exceptionalities that we tend to think of with special education, but also things like poverty and trauma and culture, language, kids at the high end, LGBTQ kids that have a very difficult time in many places still, and that's hard to believe in this day and age, but being accepted. And so again, I think she and I are talking about the same things. We just maybe start at different points and with a different emphasis. One of my teachers used to joke with us when we were trying to pronounce some big new word and say, you just put the emphasis on a different syllable. And I kind of think that's what we're doing for the most part, just putting the emphasis on a different syllable. But in terms of getting to know kids, my sense is that the first big step is, I want to do that. I need to do that. So I'm going to look out of the window when they get off the buses in the morning and see what I can learn. I'm going to watch them in the cafeteria if I'm in there. I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning of every class sharing stories with the kids and asking them to share theirs. I'm going to look at the work that they do, not as something to record in a grade book, but something that shows their personality or their interest. I'm going to ask them what their interests are. I'm going to do some strength-based assessment so I can see what their best features are, because I might miss those if I don't otherwise. I'm going to give them as many choices as I can give them. I'm going to ask them really often in a way that doesn't put them on the spot. What's working for you in here and why is it working? And what's not working for you in here and why is it that way? And if we're trying to make this a classroom that really works for everybody, what do we need to do? What's our next step to make it better than it is today? I think the intent to know students is what gets you there. I mean, think about yourself on a plane or a bus or a train. For me, unfortunately, because I'm a hermit, an introvert of the worst variety, and I think Katie's an extrovert of the highest variety. My thing on a plane usually is, I'm not here. Please don't look at me. Please don't say anything to me. And I get off that plane not knowing anybody. But if I am sitting next to somebody and we get into a conversation, I pretty quickly get deeply into it, and I'm finding out fascinating things and making connections because I meant to do it. And I think there's a huge thing on that. Every time I'm working with high school teachers, people say, you don't understand, this is just not feasible. I have 130 kids and that's just not doable. And I try for us to talk about it a little bit before I talk about the fact that in my early teaching, 150 was the smallest enrollment I ever had, and it went up from there. And then I tell them a story of a teacher that wrote me from China telling me the things she was doing to differentiate for her students. And I was picking up ideas from her all over the place. And then she said, the reason I really wrote you is I'm wondering if you have any further advice to give a teacher who has 90 students in every class. And, she's working at it and she's getting somewhere because she sees a need and she wants to. And I think that's it. But there's so many ways you can stop by a desk and kneel down and talk to a kid. I saw a teacher in Chicago, the high school teacher that does this wonderful thing. Anytime he gives the kids a task that's on a piece of printed paper that he gave them, and sometimes even if it's notebook paper, he has a prompt at the top of it that he asks the kids to fill in. And it's something like, what's your favorite kind of pizza? Or tell me a good movie that you've seen recently that you think I ought to like. Or one that he wrote on there that I thought was really great and worked really well was, suggest a book to me that I can read to my second grader. And all the kids shared, the second grade stuff. One day he said, what would you rather be doing than being in this class right now? I think that's a gutsy question to ask, and he learned some things. But the kids would tell you that he's the best teacher they have, and it's because he cares to know them. And because he cares to know them, he gets to know them. So there are many strategies, that you can use to do that. But just that desire is on the train. I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm not going to do it. I can't do it. I don't want to do it. And it's not going to happen. And I really want to meet these people and figure them out. And so many ways you can do that.
Yeah. So in the spirit of understanding that there's, I think, a lot of skill and nuance in the process of teaching and learning, right? And there can be discussions and debates about what differentiation is and is not, what UDL is and is not. But within it, there's also prioritization and attentiveness to purpose, right? There's plenty of practices or goals that are a relevant part of instruction, but that may tend to be over or underemphasized, right? That yes, this is something we can do, but it's not the thing to pay the most attention to. I'm wondering, Carol, if there's anything that comes to mind when you're working with educators and on differentiation, or as you might call it, teaching, right? That there just tends to be either and or kind of an overemphasis on, like, this is something but it's not the most important thing, or vice versa, that there's something that we should pay more attention to that tends to get deprioritized.
One of the things that sort of hard for me to deal with, because it is hard to deal with, it's just out there and it's hard to fight. But the differentiation is a set of instructional strategies. I don't think anybody says, it has to be these 6 strategies, but it's just about the instructional piece. And while the instruction piece, of course, really matters because that's the point at which the learning is really supposed to happen. If you see it as, oh, well, I can't create a different assignment for kids every day. There's a lot of, I can't create different assignments for every kid in the classroom, and nobody's ever said they should, and it makes no sense, and you can't do it. But if you get past that, it's all about instructional strategies. And for me, the instructional strategies matter, but they begin to become much easier to manage as you begin to manage time flexibly and to manage the way you present things to kids flexibly, and as you get kids to work in flexible groups with one another, and those become strategies themselves. And so for me, that's one of the things that is a limitation of people's understandings. One of the areas that I think I must just have some genetic deficiencies, but I can't keep myself from pushing on, is the practices that we have in public school that are just downright ineffective, and they don't come from our knowledge of the field. They don't come from any kind of research. So one of the biggest barriers to me is I have a curriculum and I have to cover it, and I have to cover it by this date. And talk about barriers for kids. By the time that happens, you violated one of the most important principles of differentiation, and I think UDL as well. And this is, it's not about you and what you have to do. It's not about something you call a curriculum that you have to cover. And by the way, brains don't learn that way, and brains that have extra challenges really don't learn that way. And even the ones that can hate it when they have to learn that way. So we really need to look at some of those big things and understand, for example, that curriculum is that standards are an ingredient for dinner. They aren't dinner, but we use them as though they're dinner, and that's what kids are supposed to consume. So I spend a chunk of time, because I'm somehow weirdly compelled to, looking at some of those things that I think are real barriers, as Katie would say. I think barriers to excellent learning opportunities for all kids. Just the things that, forget differentiation, forget UDL, but it's just stuff that we do, I guess, because we've done it for 1,000 years. And really, mostly, that's not quite fair. We do it because we're afraid of the change, and we don't know how to make the change happen. And so we hang on with our teeth to the way we've always done things.
Yeah. Katie, anything from your experience and your perspective that it's, over or under prioritized?
So I think with universal design for learning, one way that it's often characterized is voice and choice. So how do we design a learning environment that optimizes student voice and student choice? However, the choice part is often very overemphasized because it's not so much about kids can do whatever they want, whenever they want, in its romper room, but it's all about really construct relevant choices. And it comes down to what really is it that all learners have to know, or what do all learners have to be able to do? And then what are the potential pathways that they will need to do that? So I see a lot of quote unquote like choice boards. And I'm like, but what's the purpose of this time? Like, all these kids have all these choices, and that's amazing. But like, what subject are we in? What are we working towards, right? And so let's say that it is something like students are learning about how to produce argument writing. And certainly they can choose the prompt, and certainly they can choose what they're going to do in each component of the writing process. What does pre-writing look like? Is it brainstorming? Is it collaborating? Is it researching? What does drafting, look like, or planning? Is it graphic organizers? Is it an outline? Is it working together? Is it working alone? Right. And we can personalize all these things, but ultimately we want students to know how to leverage tools to produce writing. And sometimes I'll see choice boards and, well, that student doesn't like to write, so they're just going to tell me. I'm like, but one of the goals is that they learn how to produce writing, and certainly they can leverage voice typing. We can go through lots of different iterations of peer review. Writing could be in a comic series or a blog. But I think that sometimes we're just so focused on the choice that we lose sight of what really is it that we're working toward. What is the goal for all students? And that makes it less work for teachers. So I love food analogies as well. And, I always talk about UDL is not a casserole, it is a buffet. So if I want everyone to come over and eat dinner, then my goal is dinner. I don't have to worry about every type of food that you could eat for breakfast or for, a snack. It's like, okay, if my goal is dinner, what are the predictable barriers? Some people don't eat meat, some people are vegetarians. I'm just going to put out some options so everyone can have dinner. I'm going to put out some options so everyone can learn more about photosynthesis. I'm going to provide options so students can share their writing. But I think that what is often overemphasized is the flexible means without first thinking of the purpose and the goals that we have for kids. So that can get in the way sometimes, because I'll walk into classrooms and I'll say, it's incredibly flexible, but there's a real opportunity gap here because students aren't working towards what would be considered rigorous for their grade level. It's not authentic, it's not meaningful. So you have to balance all of those things with the flexibility.
Excellent. So this is by nature going to have to be an incomplete definition, but I think it's worth touching on. Many of our listeners, probably most of them, are in school leadership roles. And so as they're hearing all of this and kind of hopefully getting some great ideas out of this conversation, there might be the question of like, what is my role in all this? What should I do if I want to foster a culture of instructional efficacy, collective efficacy, et cetera, around teaching and learning in some of the ways we're describing? In brief, I guess, like what do you see as the role that school leadership should be playing in that, and or the pieces that they should be leaving teachers to have autonomy over? But yeah, I mean, you define it. Carol, I'll have you start with that.
Again, I think one of the things that matters most is go back to Katie's why. I think we have a pretty clear sense that change happens better when a leader has a vision for what's going to happen and is smitten with it to the degree that they can't honestly go home at night and think we're not paying attention to this adequately. This is the big challenge for our time. This is the big challenge for our century. And to create that vision in such a way that they can share it compellingly with faculty, but also invite faculty to have input to it and to own it and to work forward. But it needs not to be we're going to do UDL or differentiation this year because some entity's going to come assess us and we have to do it, or we haven't done that yet. Where I'd get rich, Katie, is if I had even a dime for every time somebody has said to me, oh yeah, differentiation, we did that last year. Both of these things are a lifetime pursuit. And so I think to have that vision, and then I think a second thing there is to choose leaders from around the school that can talk with you and think about that vision and where it might go and how it might work. So you can do some distributed leadership, and you're not the only person that's trying to make this happen, but you have counselors and you have department chairs or grade level leaders, and you have English language learner teachers, and you have teachers who work in special ed, you have sociologists, whoever's in the building that has an investment in this and an interest in it, so that you have some people who can plan with you. And it seems to me like going down that road, then, to talk about kind of what Katie was here, there need to be some choices so that we can actually say to a teacher, here's what we're talking about, and here's what it looks like. Here's a framework for it. And here's how we're going to help you learn about it, because we don't, any of us have enough knowledge now. And so we're going to learn together. But as you go down that road, to be able to say, there's some things that I think as a school, all of us need to work on this year. But I also want every teacher to take something that's a part of this puzzle that they're passionate about and work on that as well. So they have both the thing that's going to help move the school forward and the thing that's going to help them move forward. And I think one of the things that is most useful to me to think about in working with leaders is we talk about in differentiation how important the learning environment is, and what a compelling, what John Hattie would call an invitational learning environment looks like, and what compelling curriculum looks like, engaging, focuses on understanding, what kinds of formative assessment we can use with kids, and the importance of having formative assessment until people are really ready for something that's more summative. Talk about the variety and the ways people learn. We talk about how you get kids to work with you to manage all of this. What I talk about with leaders a lot is you need to model for your teachers every one of those things. If you want a learning environment in the classroom to look like this, how are they going to see that happening for them? If you're talking about curriculum that's compelling, what are you going to do to make professional development compelling and focused on these outcomes? Not everybody chooses what they want, again. So modeling that kind of thing and doing exactly what you would do in a UDL classroom or a differentiated one, which is I'm assessing all the time. I'm trying to get to know these people all the time. I have to understand where they are, what their next steps are, how we can help them get there. When they're frustrated, I have to help them get over the frustration. So it's a big plan, but it is, in the schools where I have seen that happen, it's revolutionary for pretty much everybody that's in the plan, although again, never finished. But I think starting with why and moving from there. So what's it going to look like, and how can we get to it? What steps are we going to follow? And what's our plan for this year? And by the way, what's our plan for 5 years from now? So folks know it's not, we did differentiation last year and we just quit. Those are a few things.
Excellent. Katie, do you have anything in particular for school leaders?
I mean, I was going to go heavy on the modeling, but I'll add that UDL, differentiated instruction, those are not your goals. Your goals are increased student outcomes. And so I think sometimes when I come out and work in a district, it's like, oh, our goal is UDL. I'm like, no. Like, that's a change idea. That's a framework to help you increase the outcomes of all learners, whether that is their academic outcomes, social emotional outcomes, their sense of belonging, their confidence as learners. But I think sometimes we look strategically at a plan and we say, our goal is UDL, our goal is culturally responsive pedagogy, our goal is trauma-informed instruction. And the goal really is that we want all students to learn at high levels and experience a classroom where they are challenged, where they are supported, where they feel like they belong. And we can pull lots of different sources of data to determine how far away we are from that vision of all students having these outcomes. And ultimately, we're leveraging frameworks like universal design for learning and differentiated instruction to get us closer and closer to that point, which is, again, the need for constant assessment, not of annual standardized test data. That's the least important of the data family, but really to be looking at what is the experience like for children and their families and the community. And if we have this vision that we're all working towards, are we living that vision throughout our improvement plan? So I think that sometimes people get so stuck on UDL for the sake of UDL, or DI for the sake of DI, and it's UDL for the sake of way better outcomes for these brilliant kids who we're serving. And the frameworks, because there is a long history, which each of them can provide us with some concrete strategies with some, impact studies and effect sizes that give us this demonstration of impact of things that we can do. But the reason that we're doing it is because we're not at a place yet where all kids have equitable opportunities to learn at high levels and live the lives that they want to live.
Yeah. Yeah. Katie, you have a podcast now, so I'm going to put you on the spot again. What question would you ask Carol?
What question would I ask to Carol?
Yeah, I'm going to take a
Ooh.
break. I'm getting paid
Oh my gosh.
regardless.
Oh my gosh. I love this.
You
Okay.
get
No, I love this. You know, what I would say, Carol, is if somebody, I know that people ask me this all the time. They always say, what can I do tomorrow? Right? Teachers are overwhelmed, leaders are overwhelmed. Okay. So you're talking about this framework that is synonymous with we have to do all this teaching thing better. But what can I do tomorrow to grow in my practice if I want to approach planning through this kind of lens of differentiated instruction?
But one of the things that I think is really important, and this is true with kids, kids come into our class and we say, you're going to learn algebra this year. And they go, I can never learn algebra in a year. And sometimes they don't. And sometimes it's the world against us. And sometimes we're against ourselves. But we don't ask them to learn algebra the first day. We ask them to take a step and keep moving and understand the concepts until they become larger. So I think it's important to say to teachers two things. This is big change we're talking about, and you can't get there except one step at a time. So one comment that I make often in differentiated classrooms is to kids, you're responsible for your own next step today, not what the guy next to you is doing, but for your own next step. So do you want to start with your environment? Are you kind of itching to do something different with your curriculum? Because that's an okay place to start too. And if you're really just kind of worried about how you handle vocabulary in your English class, then start there. It's okay if you're a secondary teacher and have a whole bunch of classes, start with the class that needs you the most in that way. But it's also okay if you start with the class that's easiest for you, so you're not scared to death every time you go in. If you're an elementary teacher and you absolutely love teaching science, then think about starting in science to go where you need to go. It's a one step at a time thing, and you don't bring home a baby from the hospital and 2 nights later say, well, I've got the parenting thing now, I've done that. The parents I know who have 40-year-olds are still learning how to parent, and it's a very different thing at 40 than it was at 4 and 14. So I think our sense of, as Jay McTighe would say, start small, think big, and go for an early win in October, which is his political statement. And I think that's really what we need to be doing as leaders, but also encouraging teachers to do it for themselves. Understand the opportunities you have here and say to yourself, I'm getting there and I'm going to get there. And I'm pretty psyched about that. But start one step at a time and start in a place you feel like you can have an early win. And then, as Rose says, keep thinking about it, keep reflecting on it, keep asking what's working for whom and why, and what's not working for whom and why. One of the lines that I love a lot of his work, but in his first honker big book, he said we need to quit asking what works, because the idea that one thing's going to work for everybody is nuts. So the question really is what's working for whom, and why is it working for that person, and why is it working right now, and when it's not working for somebody, why? And it's just that constant studying. If parents knew how hard parenting was, they'd probably leave more of those kids in the hospital. But once you own them, once you own those kids, you have to keep slogging if you want to do it well. And I don't think we're asking more than that. Teaching's hard, and it ought to be. And we say to kids all the time, you can do hard things. So can teachers, one step at a time. So maybe that's part of it.
So as we're kind of getting towards the end here, and this could go on and on, but I want to give you each maybe a chance for some closing thoughts to kind of summarize, like, what if somebody was listening to this and trying to think about what should I take away from this conversation, or if somebody asked me what was that episode about and I need to give them an answer, what would be your message to a listener, like the most important thing to take away, to think about? Carol, I'll let you go first.
I think about writ large, push against the boundaries of our teaching that don't work very well these days. We teach in much the same way we did when the westward expansion was happening in the United States. We teach much the same way we did, in World War I, World War II. And we really have done very few things to examine those practices that have a life of their own. So consider the human beings who come to us. And remember that those human beings are not only our responsibility, but they're our opportunity. And even if you don't really have very clear sense of direction, you can sit down and say, let's look at these people. Who's excited to come to class? Who doesn't show up? Who shows up but isn't really show up? What kids trying really hard but working against the tide? What can we do to push against those boundaries? And I think UDL and DI are heading in that same direction.
Katie?
So I oftentimes use analogies, and for me, the analogy that I use often is I was a basketball player. I mean, I'm going super glory days because I haven't played basketball since high school, but I was a pretty good baller in high school. And if you think of all of the different discrete things that you have to do in basketball, you'd be buried, right? If you're talking about, I have to learn all these passes and all of these plays, and I have to dribble, and I have to have a high vertical, and I have to be able to do out of bounds plays and fast breaks and zone defense and man-to-man defense, right? And it goes on and on and on. You could list these things forever. And we're not overwhelmed because we simply say it's basketball. And you take a lot of different tips from different parts of your life, right? Different coaches, different professional teams you're watching. And at the end of the day, you create your own version of the game, right? And we know now, Caitlin Clark's created her own version of the game. And Jason Tatum from the Celtics has created his own version of the game. But all of them are really pulling from the same, I guess, foundations of what it means to play basketball. And right now, teachers are required to create more inclusive classrooms where students have really great outcomes. And if we look at it as trauma-informed instruction, SEL, differentiated instruction, UDL, linguistically appropriate instruction, the 5E framework, and you start thinking about all of these different things, it almost feels like it's unsustainable. But what does it mean to create an amazing classroom for all kids? And so these are essentially two frameworks that, have bodies of different research of how do we push back against one size fits all teaching and learning, because we believe all kids are really capable. But like the way that teachers balance not only DI and UDL, but all of these different frameworks is going to be kind of unique to their own learning environment, their own version of the teaching game. And that's almost what makes it magical, is how we balance out what we've learned and what our students need. Because again, every basketball game is different because contextually who we're playing against, who we're playing with. And it's almost like every day in the classroom is different. And so you need to know how to dribble, and you need to know how, to shoot. And even though two out of bounds plays might be really similar, they're trying to accomplish the same thing. Right. And so what I'm hearing is that, sure, there are nuances of differences if we made a Venn diagram, but they're both meant to include all students, provide all students with opportunities to learn, provide all opportunities for students to share what they know, but in a way that we're constantly measuring that impact and making adjustments as necessary. Because as much as we can predict some barriers, there are some barriers that we will never predict, like COVID, until it's sitting in our lap, and then we need to immediately respond.
Yeah, that's, lots of great thoughts here and lots of things to listen to. Listen to this as many times as you like. There's no limit. I guess my last question to both of you would be, you each reference some financial opportunities. If you could have $1 or so every time somebody asks you kind of what's the difference here. Before we publish this, and you might get that question fewer times, would you like to just, have the chance at the $1 billion, or would you rather if we go ahead with publishing the episode?
I'd take the published episode in a minute. Assuming we said anything clear enough for people to wrap around, if we did that, then yeah, go ahead, you're good. If we could just stop two of those questions, it would be an improvement on the digestive system of both of us, I imagine.
I think the title of this is the $2 billion podcast.
Well, you'll get an audience if nothing else.
Yeah.
All the tips you need. Yes. Well, thank you so much both for being here. Thank you, listeners, for being a part of this. We'll put links below if you want to check out any of Katie and Carol's latest books. You can find most of Katie's from CAST and Carol's from ASCD, but we'll put the links there so that you can easily go and find any other resources, anything else you'd like to use in your school. Please also do subscribe to The Authority. We lived up to our name for one day at least. We had a couple of real authorities here on the show, but we also have lots of great guests every week. So please do subscribe, check out some of our other episodes, and let us know anybody you'd like to hear here on the show. So Katie and Carol, thanks again for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Do you want to simplify your school's technology, save teachers time, and improve students' performance on state assessments? You can do it all, but don't waste another minute. Head straight to ixl.com/BE to learn how IXL's research-proven teaching and learning platform can help you achieve all of these goals. That's ixl.com/BE.